The year was 1305. London was already awake, its streets alive with the noise of traders calling out their prices, carts creaking under weight, and horses clattering across damp cobblestones. But that morning, something darker stirred beneath the daily rhythm of the capital. A crowd was gathering, thousands of them, shoulder to shoulder, breath hanging in the August air. They weren't there for bread or cloth or news. They were there to see a man die. Not just any man, but William Wallace, the defiant Scottish knight who had dared to challenge the English crown and had become a living symbol of rebellion. People came not only to watch an execution, but to witness a spectacle. What unfolded that day wasn't merely justice, it was a performance, calculated and cruel. The English crown under King Edward I, known as Longshanks, wanted more than to end a life. He wanted to send a message, one so brutal, so vivid, that it would be etched into the collective memory of both the English and the Scots for generations. The punishment chosen for Wallace wasn't just death, it was destruction. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. A sentence reserved only for the worst traitors, one that promised a long, agonizing farewell to the world. To Edward, Wallace was no longer a man. He was a warning. And that warning had to scream louder than any sword or battle cry ever could. But before we look at the execution itself, the ropes, the fire, the knives, we have to understand who Wallace was and why his death was staged with such monstrous care. Because the horror of that day began years before the scaffold was built. At the end of the 13th century, Scotland was a land fractured by politics and pressed under the shadow of English ambition. Following the death of King Alexander III and the disappearance of his heir, Scotland was left leaderless, vulnerable, and ripe for conquest. Edward I saw an opportunity and took it. He declared himself overlord of Scotland, appointed his own governors, and demanded oaths of loyalty from Scottish nobles. Many submitted, but not all. From this chaos emerged Wallace, not a high-born noble with a title, but a lesser landowner whose life had been twisted by English cruelty. His family was torn apart by occupation. He wasn't driven by a thirst for power, but something colder, deeper, vengeance and justice. He struck first at Larnach, where he reportedly killed the English sheriff who had murdered his wife. Then came Stirling Bridge in 1297, where Wallace, leading a force of farmers and fighters, defeated a larger English army in a stunning ambush that would echo across the kingdoms. His victory was both strategic and symbolic. It proved that England's invincibility was a myth, that Scotland, torn and trembling, could fight back. For a brief moment, Wallace was guardian of Scotland, hailed as a hero by some and a danger by others. But glory fades. Months later, he was defeated at Falkirk, his forces scattered, his allies dwindling. Edward's vengeance was patient, but absolute. Yet Wallace refused to disappear. He didn't beg for pardon, he didn't bow. For years he was a ghost in the hills, a rallying cry, a legend growing darker and louder with every English campaign. His defiance became unbearable to the English crown and even to some of Scotland's nobles who had made their peace with submission. Eventually, betrayal did what no army could. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, most likely betrayed by a fellow Scot. His captors dragged him south in chains, and so began the final chapter of his life. Not as a warrior on horseback, but as a prisoner, bruised, shackled, paraded from town to town so that every English eye could see how rebellion ends. But even in chains, Wallace stood tall. That's what terrified Edward the most. To understand the horror of William Wallace's execution, we must first understand the world that made it possible. A medieval kingdom held together not by loyalty, but by fear. Scotland in the late 13th century was a land caught in chaos. It was a nation without a king, torn between rival noble families and constantly under pressure from a powerful neighbor to the south. After the death of King Alexander III and his only heir, Scotland plunged into succession crisis, leaving its future uncertain and vulnerable. Edward I of England, later called Longshanks, saw this turmoil as an opportunity. To him, Scotland wasn't a sovereign nation, but a wayward province that needed to be brought under heel. William Wallace rose not from privilege, but from rage and loss. He was no high-born nobleman groomed for leadership. He was a minor landowner whose life had been shaped by English cruelty. His father was likely killed in skirmishes against English forces, and Wallace himself had suffered under occupation. When he took up arms, it wasn't for glory. It was personal. At Stirling Bridge in 1297, Wallace led a Scottish force that defied all odds and crushed an English army. It was a victory not just of strategy, but of spirit. For the first time, ordinary Scots saw that the English war machine could bleed. But Edward was not a monarch to forgive defiance. He had already earned a reputation as a ruler who ruled through force, crushing Welsh resistance, expelling Jewish communities, and imposing his will through brutal efficiency. In Wallace's rebellion, he saw not only a challenge to his rule, but a spark that could ignite further insurrection across his fragile realm. Wallace had to be made an example of, and that example had to terrify. For years, Wallace evaded capture. He became a ghost in the Highlands, a symbol more than a man. But symbols are dangerous to empires. The longer he lived, the more powerful his legend became. Edward poured resources into finding him, relying on a network of spies, informants, and collaborators. Many former allies of Wallace, under pressure or fear, turned against him. Some did it for gold, others to save their families. In August 1305, betrayal came not from an English soldier, but from a fellow Scot. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, likely through the treachery of Sir John de Menteith, a knight who had pledged loyalty to the English crown. What followed was a victory not of war, but of politics. Wallace, now a prisoner, was paraded through the countryside like a war trophy. The English wanted the world to see that resistance had a face, and that face was bound, beaten, and silent. They dragged him in chains toward London, not simply for punishment, but for performance. His journey was slow and deliberate. Towns along the route were informed in advance, and people gathered in crowds to catch a glimpse of the Butcher of England, as English propaganda called him. For the English elite, this was more than justice. It was a demonstration of power. For the common folk, it was spectacle. By the time Wallace reached London, he had already suffered degradation at every turn. But the worst, the unthinkable, still lay ahead. By the time William Wallace arrived in London, he was no longer a man, but a myth, reduced to flesh and bone by the English machine of power. Yet even myths must stand trial, or at least appear to. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was hauled before a tribunal in Westminster Hall, the great chamber where kings and nobles once debated the affairs of the realm. He stood shackled in front of a crowd eager to see him condemned. Above him, judges loyal to King Edward I presided not over justice, but over the final act of a carefully orchestrated drama. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand, though, in truth, there was no need for translation. The outcome had been written long before his arrival. He was charged with high treason against the English crown, along with murder, arson, and sacrilege. The irony was impossible to ignore. Wallace was accused of betraying a king he had never sworn allegiance to. When given the chance to speak, he reportedly said, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." It was a defiant, unflinching truth, and it sealed his fate. But the trial was not about guilt or innocence. It was about humiliation. It was a performance designed to give the illusion of fairness, a legal mask worn by raw vengeance. Every charge, every word, every nod from the judges was aimed not at justice, but at legacy. The English crown wanted to rewrite history in real time, to erase Wallace the hero and replace him with Wallace the criminal. The sentence once read left no room for misunderstanding. He would be drawn through the streets of London, dragged by horse on a wooden hurdle to the execution ground. There he would be hanged by the neck, but not until death. While still alive, he would be disemboweled, his organs burned before his eyes. Then, beheaded, his body cut into 4 parts. Each fragment would be sent to a different Scottish city, a warning carved in human flesh. Every element of this sentence was symbolic. The dragging signified shame, the hanging, the stripping of divine favor, the disembowelment, the destruction of spirit, the quartering, the obliteration of identity. This was not merely about ending a life, it was about erasing a legacy. On the eve of his execution, Wallace was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Alone, battered, and stripped of all dignity, he awaited the dawn. There are no surviving records of his final words or prayers, but one can only imagine the thoughts that filled his mind, of freedom unfinished, of comrades fallen, of a homeland that might still arise. The morning of August 23rd arrived, clear and quiet, but it would end in chaos and blood. As dawn broke over the city of London on August 23, 1305, the people stirred with anticipation. Word had spread quickly that today would bring the execution of the infamous Scottish rebel William Wallace. From narrow alleys to market squares, the city buzzed with the excitement of spectacle. For the English crown, it was not just justice being served, it was theater, deliberate, grand, unforgettable. Wallace was stripped of his garments and bound tightly to a wooden hurdle, a flat board dragged behind a horse, not a cart of mercy, but a sledge of shame. As the horse began its slow march from the Tower of London to Smithfield, the execution ground, the dragging alone inflicted brutal punishment. Cobblestones shredded his skin, and each jolt from the uneven street brought fresh agony. He was paraded like a defeated animal, a warning etched in blood for all who dared defy the king. The route was carefully chosen, winding through the busiest parts of the city. Vendors lined the way, hawking food and ale, as if preparing for a festival. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, wives whispered prayers or curses, and men shouted with glee or contempt. It wasn't just justice, it was entertainment, a carnival of cruelty under the bright summer sun. Arriving at Smithfield, Wallace was hoisted onto the scaffold. The crowd pressed in, thousands of faces craning to see every detail. Above them all, banners of the English crown fluttered, their presence a reminder that this was more than punishment. It was domination, power on display for all of Britain to witness. First came the hanging. He was suspended by the neck, but not in the quick drop that might break a spine and bring swift death. No, This was a partial hanging, engineered to let him strangle slowly, his feet kicking, his chest heaving, his skin turning a dark blue. Just as unconsciousness crept in, he was cut down, still alive, still aware. Then came the knife. Before a hushed and horrified crowd, the executioner sliced open Wallace's abdomen. His organs were pulled out, methodically, monstrously, and displayed for all to see. His intestines, liver, and stomach were held aloft like trophies, then cast into a nearby fire. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, mixing with the cries of the crowd and the low moans of the dying man. It wasn't enough to kill him, not yet. This act, the burning of his entrails, carried a deeper message. In medieval belief, the bowels were thought to house the emotions, the soul's seat. To destroy them publicly while Wallace still breathed was to rip apart not only his body, but his humanity. The man who had once inspired armies was being reduced to ash, one organ at a time. Throughout it all, Wallace is said to have remained conscious. His eyes wide, unblinking, stared out at the mob. Some say he mumbled prayers, others that he cursed his captors. But what struck the witnesses most was that he never screamed, not once. He faced his tormentors with a silence louder than any plea. And yet the end had not come. The horror did not end with disembowelment. Even as smoke from the burning organs curled into the morning sky, Wallace's body remained a spectacle in waiting. The executioner, calm, deliberate, moved to complete the ritual. With his blade still wet, he reached for the heart. Some accounts say Wallace was still breathing when the executioner cut it out. His heart, the symbol of defiance, held up for all to see before it too was cast into the fire. This was not just mutilation. It was a message carved in flesh, a sovereign statement that resistance would be torn out by the root and burned before the eyes of the world. Then came the final act. With a swift motion, the executioner lifted his axe and, with one clean stroke, severed Wallace's head. The body collapsed, lifeless at last, though even in death his torment was not complete. His head, bloodied, half-lidded, was displayed before the crowd, who responded with cheers, groans, and stunned silence. The severed symbol of Scottish rebellion was then dipped in tar and prepared for a gruesome afterlife atop London Bridge. But the brutality did not end there. Wallace's body, already desecrated beyond recognition, was now to be quartered, cut into 4 distinct pieces. His limbs were hacked away like cuts of meat from a butcher's block, and each quarter was claimed not by the grave, but by the English crown, to be sent northward. Each piece would be displayed in a different Scottish city: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. There, nailed to gates or spears, the remains would rot in public view. It was anatomy as propaganda. His body, once a rallying force for unity, was now a fragmented warning. Here is what becomes of those who dream of freedom. The political precision of it all was chilling. Every element of Wallace's death had been planned, not just to kill a man, but to unmake a myth, to disassemble a national memory. The crowd had seen blood and fire, but what they had really witnessed was a state, fully unmasked, using violence as performance, terror as policy. And yet, despite the English effort to annihilate Wallace's image, something strange began to happen. Rumors spread, not of his cowardice or failure, but of his bravery, his silence under torture, his defiance in court, his refusal to beg for life. These details clung to memory like wet ash to skin. Even as his body was scattered, his legend was growing, piece by piece. As his tarred head glistened in the sun above the Thames, it did not say traitor to all who passed beneath. To some, it whispered a different word: martyr. Edward I believed that William Wallace's execution would silence the Scottish cause once and for all. He had orchestrated the spectacle down to the last flicker of flame, certain that the terror would take root in the hearts of rebels and extinguish any remaining defiance. And for a moment, it seemed to work. The streets of Edinburgh were quieter, the nobles bowed their heads lower. Even the common folk spoke less often of freedom and more often of survival. But death has a way of transforming men into symbols, especially when the death is that brutal. The image of Wallace's execution, meant to shame and deter, began to have the opposite effect. His dismembered body became a ghost in the Scottish conscience, impossible to bury and impossible to ignore. The more England tried to erase him, the more unforgettable he became. In taverns and farms, in cold stone churches and firelit halls, the story spread. Wallace had not cried out. Wallace had stared death in the face. Wallace had defied a king and paid the price without fear. Every retelling was a little bolder, a little more heroic. His pain became legend. His silence became prophecy. Among those who heard these stories was Robert the Bruce. A nobleman with his own ambitions, Robert had once walked the delicate line between submission and rebellion, but Wallace's death changed that. It revealed the true face of English rule, not just occupation, but humiliation. Not just defeat, but desecration. Wallace had shown what the English crown would do to a man who stood alone, and Robert realized that the only way forward was together. In the years that followed, Bruce would rise to become King of Scots. And in his rise, Wallace's name would be whispered in battle camps and royal courts alike, not as a failure, but as a spark. Meanwhile, in England, the story was beginning to slip from Edward's grasp. Foreign diplomats who had witnessed the execution reported back in horror. The cruelty was too much, the punishment too elaborate. What was meant to display strength had exposed something else: fear. The international image of England began to shift. Allies winced, enemies plotted, and even within England, the brutal death of a man so steadfast unsettled the conscience of many. The king had made a martyr, not a message. In time, Wallace's remains would rot and vanish. The tar on his severed head would dry and crack. The bones nailed to gates would fall to the ground. But the story endured, passed from mouth to mouth, inked onto parchment, etched into the national memory of a people who refused to forget. He had died to crush hope, and instead, he had given it wings. Centuries have passed since the iron-tipped boots of Edward's guards dragged William Wallace to his execution. The blood that stained the cobblestones has long since faded, and the crowd that cheered his destruction has long since turned to dust. Yet the echoes remain. They echo in the songs sung by soldiers who marched beneath a Scottish sky, believing their cause just. They echo in the writings of scholars who dissected the spectacle, not just as a death, but as a moment that revealed the brutal heart of medieval power. They echo in every rebellion, large or small, where people stand against overwhelming force with nothing but their principles in hand. What Wallace suffered was not unique in the annals of history. Empires have always punished those who resist, but the way he died, and more importantly, the reason why, it offered something rarely found in executions: transformation. He was not killed simply to die. He was killed to be erased, and that is precisely why he endured. In the years that followed, his memory took on mythic proportions. Scottish chroniclers began to write of him not just as a warrior, but as a chosen figure, a symbol of divine justice against tyranny. His final words, lost to history, were imagined and reimagined, always painted in the tones of honor and steadfast courage. The arts followed suit. Ballads, plays, paintings, poems. Each generation added new colors to the canvas of Wallace's story. And while some depictions veered into fiction, the emotional truth, the sense of sacrifice, of unbroken spirit, remained unshaken. Even modern cinema, centuries removed from the events, returned to Wallace's tale. Though dramatized and simplified, the image of a man crying freedom before death reignited global interest in a cause that was once thought buried beneath medieval dust. His name became more than a name. It became an idea. An idea that even when the body is broken, the spirit can resist. That no matter how absolute the power, there is always a human heart willing to say no. And sometimes saying no is enough to shake a kingdom. But Wallace's legacy isn't confined to inspiration alone. His death became a case study, a cautionary tale in legal and moral philosophy. Centuries later, jurists and ethicists would point to his trial and execution as examples of judicial cruelty, a moment in time where law was wielded not as justice, but as theater, not as truth, but as vengeance. And in that, Wallace did not just shape the story of Scotland, he helped to shape the story of human dignity. So as we reflect on his execution, the dragging, the disemboweling, the display, we are forced to confront what such acts say about us, not just about power, but about our willingness to witness cruelty when it comes wrapped in authority. Because the truth is, Wallace's death lives not just because of what he did, but because of what was done to him. It is a mirror showing us the darkness we are capable of and the light we are willing to follow, even when it costs us everything. William Wallace was a man, a rebel, a warrior. But in death, he became something greater, a question that still demands an answer. What would you suffer for freedom? And more haunting still, what would you allow to be done to silence it?